Hey guys, I'm Izzy and this is Rachel, who's a genetic counselor. And I'm currently in the process of applying to genetic counseling programs, and Rachel already did that a while back, so we thought it'd be a good idea to talk through all the different things that you need in your application and how to apply. Hopefully that could be helpful. Rachel, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit?
Okay, great. So my name is Rachel. I graduated from McGill University 5 years ago, and I've been working in hereditary cancer since then. And I'm really excited to film this video because when I was applying to the program 7 years ago, there was really not a lot of information out there on tips and tricks on how to apply for the program, what could help you get in. So I hope this video is going to be helpful for you guys.
So the first thing we're going to talk about is applications, because obviously this is one of the most important parts. So most schools require some of the same prerequisite classes. Typically it's biology 1 and 2, biochemistry, genetics, statistics, and psychology. And then some schools require organic chemistry 1 and 2, or maybe just one of them. Sometimes they require an upper level genetics course or an upper level bio course, but for the most part, it was really just those first, I think, 5 or 6 that I listed. Also, most schools say that they want to see that you've gotten mostly A's and B's in the prerequisites, but it's really not the end of the world if you have a slip up. And I'm just going to throw a little story in here. My sophomore year of school at WashU, I fell asleep during my chemistry exam because I had mono, and I got a 29%, and so I ended up with a C in the class. So, I mean, things happen. I'm not happy about it, but it is what it is.
Yeah, and don't worry. I mean, the GPA is probably the least important part of your application. At least for the program that I applied to, my understanding was that if you had the minimum GPA required, then they would look at your application and really focus on the rest of your experience, like how much you know about the profession, all the shadowing that you might have done, which we'll talk about later in the video. But I definitely didn't have a 4.0, and I think as long as the other parts of your application are really strong, then don't be discouraged if your GPA isn't, perfect. That's fine. So especially if you're applying to a lot of programs, it's important for you to be familiar with what makes each program unique. You'll definitely want to talk about that in your interview. For example, I applied to McGill University, and they are very strong in their psychosocial counseling, which was a skill that I thought I would really benefit from learning. And I also really love that their clinical rotations start right at the beginning of the first school year. So pretty much the first month that you start school, you're already in clinical rotations, and I really like that. I know in some programs, clinical rotations don't start until year 2. So really know for every single program what you like about that program.
So how many schools did you apply to?
So I actually only applied to one school. I applied to McGill. My approach was to spend years literally preparing myself and preparing my application. By the time I applied, I knew that I was a strong candidate. I was just not very flexible because of where I was at in my life. I knew I wouldn't be able to leave my city, so there were only 2 programs, McGill and University of Montreal. And McGill, of those 2, is the only one that is accredited by the American Board of Genetic Counseling. And I did want to have the option to be able to write the American Board exam, and that limited me to only McGill. So I put all my eggs in one basket, and that was my approach, which was a little risky. And if you're only applying to one program, there's a good chance, I guess, that you won't get in. I would definitely encourage you to reapply the next year. I don't think that is a bad thing. I think the program would see that as you being very motivated to go to their particular school.
I'm applying to, I'm still trying to figure it out because right now I have 15 on my list, and I'm not going to apply to 15, but I'm probably going to apply to around 10. But it can be scary because, at the same time, every single school that you apply to, that's another chance that you might get in. But you don't want to go overboard. So I'd say make sure that you're applying to a handful of schools if you feel like that's right for you. I think most people apply to around 5 to 8. But in stats that I've seen, I'm going to see if I can put this up here. Sometimes people apply to even more than 12. It really just depends on the person.
Yeah, I think overall, the more schools you apply to, the better your chances are. But of course, there are costs associated with every application. So I think probably if you're in that ballpark of 5 to 8, you're increasing your chances.
Most schools require the GRE. Right now, because of the COVID pandemic, some schools are not accepting it and they're not looking at it at all, or some will make it optional. but for the most part, you kind of have to take it. I took it, I want to say in July or June, and my applications are mainly due in December and January. Most schools say that you want to get at least a 60% in most of the categories, if not all. But you're pretty competitive, I'd say, if you're in the 70th percentile, according to what a lot of the websites say.
So something that is really important in your application is your letters of reference. And most programs require 3, sometimes they even require 4.
Some programs say that one of them has to be an academic reference, and some of them, I know Columbia, for example, says that it has to be from the institution at which you graduated. So make sure to read specifically what each school that you're applying to wants you to do for your letters of reference. You don't want to mess that up. Extracurriculars can be really important because it just shows that you're a well-rounded person, and also you're obviously a lot more and you do a lot more than just what your application shows. So I did a ton of different things in college, so I'm going to read off some of the things. First of all, I was in an a cappella group, and that took up a lot of my time. I loved doing that. I was also in a sorority and held a few leadership positions, so I was mental health and wellness chair and then Panhellenic delegate. Those took up some time and they were really fun. I was in a play, and then also I taught Science Olympiad for 7th graders, specifically in the topic meteorology. So while that, has nothing to do really with genetic counseling, when you're a genetic counselor, you have to educate people on, complicated topics, but try to make it basic in a way that they can understand what's going on with their health. So just having an experience of teaching somebody, especially teaching somebody something where you don't want to go into full detail, but you want to give them the big picture, can be really helpful. So I'd recommend tutoring or something like that.
Yeah, I definitely did a lot of tutoring throughout the later years of high school, like tutoring for younger students. That's definitely helpful. Other extracurriculars that I had were volunteering for an organization called Friendship Circle, which is basically working with children who have disabilities, kind of to give the parents a break. So once a week we would meet with these kids and do arts and crafts, baking, just different activities. And that gave me some exposure into what it's like in the life of a child that has a disability. So I did that for a few years. Other extracurriculars, I worked as a lifeguard and a swimming instructor for many years. Honestly, I didn't really even mention this in my application. As we go through this video, you'll see that there's so many different things that you can end up talking about in your personal statement and in your CV. So for me, I don't think I even mentioned this in my application, but it definitely helps to show and make you into a more well-rounded person. Something that I think is important to know about is how the program applications have changed. When I applied 7 years ago, there wasn't the match program, but I think the match program now makes it a little bit more fair to applicants. So Izzy, do you know a little bit about the match program?
Yeah, so basically every applicant has to first apply or actually sign up on this match system. It costs around $100, and even though you apply to each school separately on their own websites, after you apply and after you get interviews, you actually have to rank the programs that you want to go to, and the programs also rank you. So from 1 through however many people they might be interested in, and then you 1 through however many schools you're interested in. And this program matches you to your school. And it's important to note that it does favor the applicant a little bit, but it's a really complicated, algorithm that I don't understand. But it ensures that the most number of people who apply get into a school. And it also ensures that a program that has, say, 5 spots, if they accept 5 students and then 3 of them don't go because they got into another school, that doesn't happen. You get into only 1 school with this match system, and you have to go to that school. So you don't want to rank any school that you don't want to go to.
And I think for people that are unmatched, there might be some options from what I've heard on the National Society of Genetic Counselors website. They have some information which we can link to. So overall, I think probably the system is a little better than it used to be.
Yeah, but even still, from statistics taken from Discord and other groups where people who are applying join, it seems that only around 30% of people who apply to any school get in anywhere, which is a really scary number. So just beware that it is very competitive. Your personal statement can be one of the most important parts, if not actually the most important part of your application, because it likely is going to talk about why you want to become a genetic counselor, which is the whole point. And they also get to see you and see your personality a little bit for the first time. So some tips that I can give to you, and I'm still working on my personal statement right now, so I might not be the best person, but make sure to tie it back to genetic counseling. So it's okay if that's not really what your entire statement is about, but make sure that it does in fact tie back to genetic counseling, and see if you can bring in some examples of maybe some case studies that you've seen. If you realize that it has some sort of relevance to your application, add it in your personal statement. Also, don't just repeat back your resume. That's what they always say, that's really boring. They have your resume for a reason. Don't do that.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I think your personal statement is one of the most important parts of the application, because this is really where they get to see you for who you are as a person. So I think you should try to make it read as a story, like kind of your story of how you got to the point of application. And once you've done all your shadowing and your counseling and all those experiences that you've collected, there's nothing really much more that you can do to change your application package except for your personal statement. This is the one thing that is now within your control to change and improve upon. So personally, what I did is I wrote it many months before applications were due, and then I asked many different people to proofread it and give me their feedback. A lot of the people that I asked are the ones that ended up writing the reference letters for me. And once I had finished the first draft, I pretty much reread it every single day and tried to improve it a little bit every single day. So by the time I applied, I felt like the personal statement really reflected who I was as a person and kind of told my story about how I got to the point of applying to genetic counseling school.
Interviews tend to happen in around February or March, just depending on the school. And if you don't get an interview somewhere, you likely, or maybe it's impossible to get in. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the interview questions that you might get asked?
Yeah, I don't remember all the specific questions that I was asked, but one thing that I think could be useful for you to prepare is to be very familiar, of course, with your personal statement and your resume, because they'll probably start off the interview like that, asking you to expand on some of the things that you talked about. So that's one useful thing you can do. I also wrote a list of some questions that I think might be asked. So in my interview, I was given a couple of clinical scenarios. For example, how would I break bad news to a pregnant couple? And how would I tell somebody that they tested positive for a particular genetic mutation? And I don't think they're looking for a very perfect answer. You're not a trained genetic counselor, of course. I think they just want to see how you would approach these kind of situations. And then I wrote a list of some other questions that I think you might come across. One of them is, can you describe what the role of a genetic counselor is? Of course, you should really know the answer to this very well if you've prepared for this application. They asked me actually if I had applied to any other programs, and I'm not sure why they asked that question. Maybe they want to see how dedicated I was. Like if you applied to many programs, maybe that can show dedication. I just focused on the fact that I really, really wanted to go to that particular school, and I emphasized what I liked about the program, so that's how I answered that question. Other questions, they asked me what my views on abortion are.
That's so interesting that they're asking you these questions. I don't want to say that it's like an invasion of privacy, but I just from hearing it, I would not have expected that. But I did listen to Kira talk about this on an episode of DNA Today, and they also asked her like how many schools she's applying to and if she was in a relationship. And if the person she's in a relationship is planning on moving with her.
I agree, and some of those questions were a little bit surprising to me, but I think the programs are trying to, first of all, just have a conversation with you and get to know you like on a more personal level, also to see what your life is like, but also to see like if they offer you a position, but then you're not actually able to really move to that city, then they maybe are kind of wasting a spot. So they also asked me what I would do if I didn't get accepted to the program. So I basically said something like, I would just ask you guys for feedback on how I could improve my application and apply again the next year. I think that shows that you are really motivated and invested.
What do you think the interviewers are like really looking for in students?
I think different programs might be looking for slightly different things, but I think they're looking for students that are teachable and open to learning, because they're not expecting you to be a genetic counselor already. They're going to teach you how to become a genetic counselor. So I think as long as you are interested in the field, you know what you're getting into, and you're teachable, then that's what they're looking for. And they're also looking for someone who hasn't rehearsed answers to all these questions. You don't want to come off sounding like a robot. You really want to be having a conversation, a two-way conversation, so you get to know the program, they get to know you, and just be as genuine as possible.
So one of the most important parts of your application is showing that you're prepared and that you know what genetic counseling is. And one of the best ways to do that is through shadowing experience. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Rachel, what do you think is the best way to ask a genetic counselor to shadow them?
So the most important thing to be aware of is that genetic counselors get a lot of requests for shadowing. So I think what's good to do is to really show that you're invested, not just that you want to come shadow 1 or 2 patients, but really that you know what the profession is about. And ideally, if you can commit to a couple of weeks or even a few months, even if the genetic counselor can't take you on for that long, but just show commitment, show that you really want to be there, and that will allow you to learn as much as possible. So yeah, just be aware that there's a lot of requests for shadowing. So if you do get a chance to shadow, you should really show the genetic counselor that you're really invested. Try to get involved as much as possible in the clinic. You can offer to see if you could be involved in preparing things for the clinic visit, like inputting hand-drawn pedigrees into a computer software. Just try to get as much as you can from your experience by being as involved as possible.
It's interesting to hear you say that, because I would have assumed that if you asked to shadow for just 1 or 2 sessions, that it asks less of the genetic counselor, so they'd be more likely to say yes.
And I think that's what prospective genetic counseling students think, because that's usually what the requests sound like. Mm-hmm. To me, it feels like they're just trying to tick off the box of shadowing on their application, but I would be impressed if somebody told me, you know, I can commit once a week for 2 months. I really want to get as much as exposure as I can. So for me, it's more about the student who stands out by showing me that they're really dedicated to doing this.
That's great to know. So take that tip. Also, right now, I mean, it's 2020. We're in the middle of a COVID-19 pandemic. And so it can be really hard to get shadowing experience. Sometimes people have been able to get experience with remote shadowing, but that could also be kind of hard to do. So, and a lot of the schools have currently recognized how hard it can be. So they recommended that you try to get as much like hands-on experience, or at least so that you could see what a genetic counseling session is like. So the NSGC website has 3 simulated genetic counseling sessions that you should watch, put them on your resume. You should go to webinars for different universities to show that you're interested and engaged, and also put that on your resume. The other thing to do is interview genetic counselors. So if you can email some and just ask if they would not mind maybe dedicating half an hour or an hour to chatting with you because you have certain questions, and make sure you come prepared. But informational interviews can be really helpful, and I learned so much from chatting with different genetic counselors. So I would definitely say that informational interviews, webinars, and also anything else like a symposium where you can learn about genetic counseling is really important, and make sure to put it on your CV/resume.
Yeah, definitely. Basically, what you want to show the genetic counseling programs by the shadowing is that you really know what you're getting yourself into. You know exactly what genetic counseling is about. So if you can't get that through shadowing, which I think programs will understand during this time of the pandemic, then I agree what you're suggesting is a good idea. Try to get as much exposure as you can in other ways.
A huge part of the application is counseling experience, and so I gathered that in kind of a few different ways. The main thing is that if you don't watch my YouTube channel and you have no idea, I have a genetic disorder, and on my channel I make a lot of videos about it, about supporting people who have the same condition as me, accessing proper treatment, and like patient advocacy and things like that. So that's where a lot of my counseling experience comes from, and I oftentimes engage with different people in like the comments section, and I also have a support group that I run. And then one thing that I do that's actually overseen by a professional is I volunteer at an eating disorder helpline. It's once a week for 3 hours, and then I also do some like logging of the chats, and I've learned so much from working on that helpline. I'm really shocked. I've learned how to, ask questions in ways that can like prompt a response that's truthful, and also just to not sound judgmental, and how to support somebody. I highly recommend trying to find a helpline that you can volunteer on. At the time, I didn't really know if I wanted to volunteer on a crisis helpline, and now I feel like I would be totally ready to do that. But at the time, before I started with this helpline, I was so scared of that idea. But you really learn a lot.
Yeah, I think for me, it was similar. I was so nervous to get involved in that kind of counseling where you're actually talking to people about real life uncomfortable situations sometimes. It's funny because I also volunteered for an eating disorder hotline. Mine was over the phone, and I also got a few months of experience working with elders in situations of abuse. So both of those for me were kind of uncomfortable in the beginning, and I think for me the biggest thing I got out of the experience was over time getting more comfortable with these uncomfortable situations, and yeah, just getting more comfortable talking to people about situations that were out of my comfort zone. And something that's really important is for all of these counseling experiences that you can get, the most important thing is to have some training. The genetic counseling programs really like to see that you've received some formal training for these counseling experiences.
Yeah, that's what I think is so valuable about volunteering on a helpline, is that you get so many hours of training, and also typically you'll have somebody who's a professional overseeing what you do and giving you feedback. And that's where I've learned the majority of like how to counsel somebody.
Besides for counseling, something else that can be really helpful is to try to actually work in a related field. So for example, I worked for about 2 years as a research assistant in cancer genetics, and I just learned so much information, which is things that I would learn later on in the program, and I just felt like that gave me a little bit of a head start in applying to the program. And something else that can be really good is if you can't work as a research assistant, maybe you can work as a genetic counselor's assistant, which is kind of a new role. Nowadays, a lot of genetic counseling tasks can be sometimes delegated to genetic counseling assistants, like entering pedigrees, data entry, sometimes even speaking to patients in advance of the appointment and collecting family history information. So by working as a genetic counseling assistant, you can gain so much information. Again, you're going to learn a lot about what the field is like, and I think that can really enhance your application.
Yeah, so for me, I majored in environmental earth science, so absolutely nothing to do with genetic counseling. So I do feel, or at least I felt like I was kind of going to be behind when it came to, knowing about genetics. I'm taking genetics right now, but I'm actually doing some research on Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome with my genetics professor, and I have learned so much about genetics, and I'm realizing just how much I love genetics. And even though I've not learned it in a classroom setting, I've gained so much knowledge from doing research. So I would highly recommend it. And I also think it will give you a good idea if this is something that you like, because, science, research, you'll be doing a lot of research as a genetic counselor, and you're going to have to learn how to continuously teach yourself new topics in genetics.
Yeah, so I think in summary, if you can get a combination of the counseling experience and then gain more information about genetics, as well as, if possible, shadow a genetic counselor, I think that will give you the best amount of exposure that you can to enter the program.
So now here are some other resources that can be really helpful. The first is that a few universities offer a prep course. So currently I'm taking one at the University of South Carolina, and it costs around $500, so it's definitely not cheap. But I have learned a lot about genetic counseling, and I just found it to be really interesting and a great prep course. So if you have the money and the time to do that, I would recommend looking into that. Also, there is a Discord group. If you have no idea what Discord is, neither did I. I literally learned about this group a month ago, and since then, I have had so many opportunities to learn more about genetic counseling. It's basically an app on your phone or on your computer, and think of it like Slack, if you know what that is, or GroupMe, and there's so many resources on there. I cannot stress joining the Discord group enough. I wish I had known about it. It seems like everybody knew about it, but I didn't. I don't know how they knew about it, but somebody told me, so highly recommend. This one is called like Genetic Counselors Safe Space or something like that, so definitely look that up.
That's so cool. Like, none of these resources were available when I was applying, so I'm jealous of how much you have available to you.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, something else that you can check out is on the NSGC website. They have what they call a student corner, and I think they link to a lot of other resources that can be, useful for your preparation.
So one of the other ways that you can learn about genetic counseling is through reading different books. So you can read educational books. So one of the ones that I've been reading, and it was actually suggested to me through a prep course that I'm taking right now at the University of South Carolina. It's called A Guide to Genetic Counseling. I'll put it up right here if you're interested in reading it. I'm not done, but I hope to finish soon. It's really interesting, and it actually teaches you what you do on the job, because it's so important to know that this is exactly what you want to do.
Yeah, and that book is actually one that we read as part of the genetic counseling curriculum. So if you read that in advance, you are way ahead of the game. I didn't read that book in preparation for the program. I probably would have benefited from reading it, but two books that I did read that were also part of our genetic counseling curriculum are, one is called Psychosocial Genetic Counseling by John Weil, and another one is called How to Break Bad News by Robert Buckman. Both of those were really excellent. They both helped me prepare for my actual interview, as well as just prepare in general to learn more about the profession. And then besides for educational books, there's also more entertainment books that help you get more exposure to the realities of some people that are living with genetic conditions.
So some of the books that I've recently just finished are Wonder by, I'll just, put the book up so I don't mess up anybody's name. And then also Strangers Assume My Girlfriend Is My Nurse. And the people who wrote this book, Shane and Hannah, also have a fantastic YouTube channel called Squirmy and Grubs. I would highly recommend it. It is so funny and so educational.
And three of my all-time favorite books are, one is called Raising Henry, a memoir of motherhood, disability, and discovery by Rachel Adams. That's a book written from the point of view of a mother who's raising a boy with Down syndrome. Excellent book. Another book that I really love is called Eating Pomegranates by Sarah Gabriel. And that is such an interesting book if you are interested in cancer genetics, and also if you're like a history buff. It really talks about how the BRCA1, or I don't know if it was 1 or 2, how the BRCA mutation might have affected people throughout the generations. So it goes back a few centuries ago, and what it would look like maybe to have a mastectomy for cancer without the conveniences of modern medicine, all the way down to today's day and age, where people with this mutation can choose to have pre-implantation genetic testing to avoid from passing on the mutation. So I love that book. I've read it multiple times. And the other book that I really love is called A Time to Decide, A Time to Heal. It's a compilation of short stories or poems by parents who have had to have medical terminations for wanted pregnancies. A lot of them are due to genetic conditions. So I think reading these kind of books can really give you some good exposure to what patients' lives might be like. And something else that you can do is just follow blogs and social media. There's so much out there now. Of course, following Izzy's channel can help you learn a lot about EDS. I personally don't work in EDS, I just work in cancer, and I've learned a lot about EDS and like the lived experience of EDS by watching the videos on her channel. And Izzy, do you know any other good channels, other YouTube channels that people can follow?
So one that I can think of right now is SBSK, or Special Books by Special Kids. And then also Squirmy and Grubs, as I mentioned earlier. They're just so funny. And I will list others down below.
Something else that's really useful to read is a blog called The DNA Exchange by Bob Resta. Bob Resta is a huge, legendary genetic counselor. I think he has close to 40 years of experience. And he's just such a good writer. You learn so much about the ethics of genetic counseling, historical perspectives, psychological perspectives. I really recommend that blog. And something else that you can do is just follow genetic counselors on social media. You can look up the hashtag GCChat, and you can learn a lot about the day-to-day things that genetic counselors deal with.
I didn't know that. I've never heard of that before. That's great.
Yeah, look it up.
Also, there are a bunch of different podcasts, but the main one that I listen to is DNA Today by a genetic counselor named Kira. She graduated, I think, just last year. It's really interesting. She interviews a bunch of different medical professionals and a lot of genetic counselors, so I would highly recommend her podcast. So that's all we have for you. Hopefully we answered all of your questions on the application process. We actually just did another video on Rachel's channel that's about what it's like to be a genetic counselor. So I highly recommend you go check that video out and that you check out Rachel's other videos because they're amazing. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask us in the comments and hopefully we can get to all those questions.
Yeah, and you guys can also feel free to message me directly if you have any particular questions about the application process. This was so much fun to film with you, Izzy. I think it's hopefully going to help some people in their application process, and I'm so happy to see just in general that there are so many more resources available. So hopefully you guys can check out my video on my channel, and then if you have any other questions about the genetic counseling profession in general or what it's like to be a student in genetic counseling school, maybe we can work on some other videos.
Great. Thanks so much, guys. See you on the next video. Bye.
Bye.